Good afternoon. So I will not thank the organizers for inviting me. In fact, this was supposed to be just a footnote to another presentation by a very distinguished historian of Indian mathematics, Amartya Datta of Calcutta Indian Statistical Institute, but he could not come. So I had initially planned a small supplement to his talk on Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray, but since he could not come, I have slightly enlarged it, and I was going to focus on one aspect alone, but I will touch upon some side aspects in addition. And the main thrust of my brief presentation is about his collaboration with Marcelin Berthelot, who was a very distinguished French chemist, senior to him. So let me first reverse. I will follow the chronological order, since Marcelin Berthelot was of a generation prior to Prafulla Chandra Ray. He was one of the most distinguished scholars of chemistry and chemists in France in the second half of the 19th century, and contributed quite a few minor discoveries in chemical processes, but nothing really fundamental to the discipline of chemistry as we know it. But he held many prestigious posts in the Academy of Sciences, in the French Academy of Letters later on. He was a very prominent figure. In fact, he did contribute to the synthesis of organic bodies like benzene, methane, acetylene, and he was one of the pioneers of thermochemistry, the relationship between heat and chemical reactions. So this was his contribution, but he was also not completely a visionary in his own field, because he tried to criticize, find limitations in the atomic theory of chemistry. This was the time when very little was known about atoms, and there were still alternate explanations to work out what was happening in chemical reactions. So he was, in that sense, he was not a great visionary, but he was an authority for whatever empirical knowledge and experimental knowledge of chemistry was known in his days. He authored many books. He was a very prolific author, and one classic in his days was this elementary treatise of organic chemistry. But then he did not limit himself, as we've seen also with the previous scientists highlighted here today. He didn't want to compartmentalize himself, and he got his PhD in the field of pharmacology. He worked in plant physiology, and he registered 1,200 patents altogether. And here we have an echo, or maybe an antecedent rather, of a similar behavior in another famous Indian scientist, which was Jagadish Chandra Bose. He refused to earn money out of his patents, and he donated them to the French state and to humanity as a whole. So he never encashed. He was approached by many industries because some of the processes, experimental processes he designed, are still used in pharmacology today. And he was approached by the industry, pharmaceutical industry in particular, but he did not sell his patents. So therefore, there is a certain idealistic or ethical side to him. He, in fact, had already an interest in what was known in the 19th century as Orientalism, the study of non-European or non-Western civilizations and culture, which usually extended to the Arab world, sometimes to the Persian world, rarely beyond. A little bit of Chinese world also, but India was still poorly known. There had been a few great French Sanskritists and Indologists. One of them was Eugène Burnouf, who was one of the pioneers of India studies in France. And it so happens that Marcelin Berthelot had taken Sanskrit courses under him at the Collège de France, which was and still is one of the most prestigious French academic institutions. So there was this attraction for the Orient, and we will see more about it in a minute. But there are many other sides to him. because this was a troubled time for France and for Paris. There was a war with Germany. Just before Germany was reunified, Paris was besieged, and people had to take, political stands. So I do not know whether we can call him a French freedom fighter, but he did lead the scientific committee for the defense of Paris, and took a strong political and republican stand in his days. After the war was over, he was made a minister, first of all for external affairs, then for education. He pioneered many visionary measures for French education, tried to modernize it, tried also to integrate science in it, and finally he was very active in what was known as the Dreyfus, the affaire Dreyfus, which you might have heard, very briefly, was how a Jewish French military officer was falsely accused of spying and sent to forced labor in French Guyana. And this actually divided France vertically into two camps, and for something like 20 years, it was the hottest topic and hottest controversy. So the French novelist Émile Zola took a very strong stand. You might have heard of the formula called J'accuse, I accuse. It was Zola who wrote a one-page article in defense of Dreyfus. And to his credit, Marcelin Berthelot was part of this fight, on the right side of it. But his last side, and what interests us today, is that he was one of the first historians of science, and probably the first very solid historian of chemistry. But when you look back into the what precedes chemistry, modern chemistry, it is not exactly chemistry. It goes by the name of alchemy. We'll see in a minute what alchemy consists of. And he pioneered several books. I will show you some of the covers of those books. They are generally about, he's pushing towards the Orient, but still he remains limited with Egypt, Greece, Syria, and there's almost no content of Chinese alchemy or Indian alchemy, simply because he did not have material about them. So these are some of his books. His first is in 1885, The Origins of Alchemy. It was his first attempt to draw a picture, but then he amplified upon it. 1889, 4 years later, Introduction to the Study of Chemistry of the Ancients and of the Middle Ages. So by that time, he signs as a senator, member of the Institute, professor at the College of France. Very, very prominent and highly respected figure, and but original in dealing with the history of chemistry. And this is his last and most important, this is his magnum opus, if you like, in 3 volumes. I'm showing you only the facsimile of the first, and that is Chemistry in the Middle Ages. And the first volume, that is here, this is first volume, essay on the transmission of science in antiquity, from antiquity to the Middle Ages. So he was trying to really understand how pre-scientific, pre-modern chemistry worked, because there were some chemical practices. People were playing with acids, with salts, with metals. They were producing medical preparations. What kind of knowledge did they have about all these bodies and how they reacted? So this is what he was trying to figure out, and it took quite a bit of his time in these last years. In fact, he was criticized by some of his colleagues for having too much interest in the history of chemistry, and one of them said that, had he not spent so much time there, he might have been a much more successful chemist otherwise. Anyway, these opinions are always there, but now let us see how he comes into contact with Prafulla Chandra Ray, who has been given, affectionately the title of Acharya, but he was, as we will see, a teacher. In fact, Berthelot was aware, Marcelin Berthelot was quite aware that he was missing a whole side of Asian alchemy or chemistry. So he sent feelers through various contacts. He contacted some Persian scholars. He contacted a Parsi scholar in Bombay, as it was then, and tried to get some manuscripts. He had been reading Greek manuscripts, Arab manuscripts. He was going to original sources for whatever he was dealing with, but he wanted to reach out further. And finally, somebody put him in touch with Prafulla Chandra Ray. So here it is not that the Indian scientist goes out in search of a Western counterpart, but it is actually the other way around in this particular case. So who was Prafulla Chandra Ray for those who might not know? In fact, sometimes in my own courses, I show this slide without the name, and I ask students, who is that? And I think about not even 1 in 10 usually can answer out of this portrait. So, as we know, he was a pioneer of modern chemistry in India. He had his education in University of Edinburgh. He pioneered several chemical processes, like he was fascinated with nitrites, first of mercurous and then ammonium. These were some of his leading achievements, but there were many other things. He published about 150 research papers in his career in various journals. But then, you see, this was the time when India was trying to not exactly fight for independence. This was even before, this was the late 19th century, but at least recreate a new foundation for itself. So he wanted to create a new generation of Indian students and scientists, and he took to the teaching profession at the Presidency College, of which we've heard quite a bit already today, where he created the first laboratory of chemistry. In fact, his achievements were soon recognized through his publications. So he was made FRS in Fellow of the Royal Society in 1913. And 1916, he joined the new University College of Science at the Calcutta University, where he lived in a small room where there was basically nothing more than a table, a chair, and a cot. And he had a very decent salary, but he was reputed for using most of it in supporting needy students. These were very difficult times, economically speaking, for India and young Indian students in particular. So, and then various charities around. For example, I think I have mentioned, oh no, this comes a little later. He did not marry, so he was in a way a model of a kind of an ascetic, a modern ascetic, if you wish, dedicated to science, but he had also some broader interests. He was influenced by the Brahmo Samaj movement, which tried to, let us say briefly, modernize Hinduism in a manner that was palatable for Europe by sanitizing a lot of Hindu practices which were thought to be obsolete, and creating a kind of new doctrine out of it. But this was a kind of a temporary interest. It did not impact his whole life very deeply, as far as I can make out. But he was very much a scientist to the core, in the sense that he wanted the scientific temper, as we say, to spread, and therefore not only dedicated a lot of time and energy with his students, but also pioneered popularization of science. He was one of the pioneers in Calcutta. There were others also. And incidentally, this is another Calcutta figure very much. For the reasons that Professor Roy Chaudhary has very nicely explained to us. Another very important interest was this rising nationalist movement. Let us keep in mind that 1905 is the partition of Bengal, which triggered a very massive popular protest. And at that time, he was drawn into it, not at the front lines, but the idea of Swadeshi, which were promoted. There were 4 great ideas which came out of the movements in 1905. against the Bengal partition, and they were Swadeshi, boycott. So this was the time, where British goods were boycotted, bonfires of British textiles were made, and Swadeshi clothes and textiles were promoted. Swadeshi, boycott, passive resistance, and national education were the four ideas which a lot of people in Calcutta in those days were talking about and promoting. So his approach into this was very much Swadeshi. How to help India stand on her feet, economically speaking, without being a colony of the British in that respect. So he took part in that movement. We will see how. And he said famously, there are occasions that demanded that I should leave the test tube to attend to the call of the country. Science can wait, Swaraj cannot. And where he left the most impact was that he used whatever he could save from his salary to invest in the creation of industries. And in particular, the Bengal chemical and pharmaceutical works was very largely his creation. And he created some others, and his technique would be to invest in an industry, try to get it on his legs, and then withdraw from it and start another. So this is what he tried to do, and therefore, in that sense, he did contribute to some economic independence, or let us say initiatives that tried to recreate. This was the time also when the awareness that the British had ruined a lot of Indian native industries like textile and others. This was a very acute awareness, and therefore there was a need to recreate native, in quotation marks, native industries. Charity also took quite a bit of whatever resources he had at his commands. He helped organize relief committees whenever there were floods in Bengal. There was a particularly devastating one in 1923. So he organized collections. Education was a great concern with him, and he founded a Brahmos girls' school out of his own funds again. Established the Nagarjuna Prize for Chemistry and some more awards. So you could see that there was a great concern with contributing to the society around. It was not just doing pure chemistry research. In fact, on his 70th birthday celebrations in 1931, Tagore presided over and in his own inimitable style said, it is stated in the Upanishads that the one said, I shall be many. The beginning of creation is a move towards self-immolation. Prafulla Chandra has become many in his pupils and made his heart alive in the hearts of many. And that would not have been at all possible had he not unreservedly made a gift of himself. Very high and touching praise, and I think very well deserved from whatever we can see. Now, Prafullas Chandra Ray had an interest also in the history of chemistry, but it was triggered by Berthelot initially. And he explains himself in this book, which we are going to see a little more in detail in a few minutes, History of Hindu Chemistry. He explained how it took place. The progress of chemical knowledge from among the ancient nations has always had a fascination for me. In the course of my studies in this field, I was naturally led to an inquiry into the exact position which India occupies therein. And with this view, I undertook a systematic examination from the chemical standpoint of the Charaka, he means the Charaka Samhita, the fundamental text of Ayurveda, the Sushruta, and the various standard works of the Ayurvedic and iatrochemical periods. Iatrochemistry means chemistry for medical applications. This was the term then used, which have escaped the ravages of time. It was at this time that I was brought into communication with Monsieur Berthelot. So in fact, it was because Berthelot was reaching out to Indian savants. Some 5 years ago, a circumstance which has proved to be a turning point, if I may say so, in my career as a student, of the history of chemistry. So he fully acknowledges his debt to Berthelot for orienting him more towards the history of chemistry. And we have in 1897 this handwritten letter from Berthelot. It's about 4 pages. It is in French, which implies that Prafulla Chandra Ray could understand French. As far as I can make out, he could at least read French fluently. And he actually, this is how he approaches Prafulla Chandra Ray to get some Indian material on alchemy. And as a result, Prafulla Chandra Ray sends him a preliminary survey, a kind of memoir of 43 pages called Materials for a Neglected Chapter of the History of Chemistry or Contributions to Indian Alchemy. So this is in 1897, and in a few months later, in the Journal des Savants, I don't have to translate, I think you can all understand, in the Journal of Savants, Berthelot comments on this memoir. Now, this Journal of Savants, by the way, is one of the oldest European papers. You can see that this is 1665. The journal is very old. It had some interruptions, but it still exists today. And in this journal, this is what Berthelot wrote. Those attempts put me in contact, so he's referring to his earlier attempts to get in touch with Indian scholars, with a learned Indian professor of Presidency College at Calcutta, Mr. Roy, who sent me a manuscript memoir on the origins of Indian alchemy. So it looks like we don't have the memoir anymore, but it looks like the whole memoir was actually handwritten because it's a manuscript. It's quite possible. The origins of Chinese alchemy and Indian alchemy are probably connected at some level with the origins of scientific, as with the origins of scientific astronomy in China and India. So he's connecting the Chinese and Indian advances in alchemy as well as in astronomy. But the later date of Indian and Chinese documents leads to the conclusion that alchemical doctrines came from the West, though they took on a character specific to Oriental civilizations. Now here you see Berthelot is assuming that the earliest knowledge of alchemy comes from the West to India and China more or less at the same time. It is not exactly it is in a way a Eurocentric prejudice. There was a tendency always to think that science had come from the Greeks, but it's not a very strong prejudice in his case. He is still open-minded. He just wants to see texts that would be as ancient as the Greek text. And as you will see, this will remain a problem with the material that Prafulla Chandra Ray gives him. So he says, I must add that his opinion does not conform to Mr. Roy's opinion. He's talking about, I think it should be my opinion, does not conform to Mr. Roy's opinion. For he believes in the originality of Indian alchemy, but more out of a sense of national glory than through positive evidence. He's here alluding to this nationalist feeling which did animate a number of Indian scholars who wanted to, establish the accomplishments, contributions of Indian civilization to world civilization. And these accomplishments in those days were still very obscure. Be that as it may, his study allows us to establish new reference points and a most important landmark in researches on the history of sciences and their propagation through humanity. So he anyhow acknowledges Prafulla Chandra Ray's contribution, though he may not agree on the fact that this alchemy that he presents is native to India. So Prafulla Chandra Ray answers, and you see here, I think he acknowledges the Journal des Savants. He writes in English, which of course assumes that Berthelot understands English, which would normally be the case. And, but then there is another thing here which is very important, which is that the 3 volumes I mentioned earlier of Berthelot, La Chimie au Moyen Âge, the chemistry in the Middle Ages, Berthelot actually sent them as a gift to Prafulla Chandra Ray. And this greatly stimulated P.C. Roy to write a comprehensive study of the antecedents of Indian chemistry. So he acknowledges all this, and then there's a long discussion which follows, but the result will be this, and which is the first volume. Today, the edition combines 2 volumes in one. You can still buy it on the market. It is also available on archive.org, the whole text. But the first volume was published in 1902, and the second volume, as we will see, in 1907. So and the first volume had a revised and enlarged edition right the next year, because even though Prafulla Chandra Ray thought that this was a highly specialized, obscure topic which would be of very little interest to most people, it was actually lapped up. And it was lapped up because it, I hesitate to say, flattered nationalist feelings, but let us say it did suddenly put in front of learned Indians some of the accomplishments in the field of chemistry. So his objective, and he says so in the preface, is that this would be throwing further light on the independent origin of the Hindu system of medicine and its priority to that of the Greeks. So this is a big claim.
Alchemy, the word comes from Persian, right?
Excuse me?
The alchemy word, that comes from Persian, right? Alchemy.
Yeah, well, it is an Arabic word. It is an Arabic word which is actually used in Arab chemistry, which usually... I am coming to the Sanskrit terms. The Sanskrit terms are here. So this was his motivation, and this is the answer to your question, that the Sanskrit terms are totally different. They are about Rasashastra, Rasavidya, Dhatuvada, and so on. These are the Sanskrit terms for this discipline. Rasa here means it has many meanings: essence, taste, sap, juice, semen, nectar, but in this sense, it is mercury. And for some reason, many of these, even later on European alchemy in the Middle Ages, everybody is going to be highly fascinated with mercury in particular, because of its unique properties and the fact that it is a liquid metal at room temperature. So there is, of course, and in all alchemy, so alchemy becomes a kind of generic term for the antecedents of modern chemistry, if you like. And whether it is Chinese, whether it is Indian, whether it is Arab alchemy, there is always some mystical, occult, esoteric aspects associated with it to explain the property of the bodies. So in the Indian context, mercury will be the embodiment, and there is a whole tantric background to it. I will not go into this this time. It is the embodiment of the male principle, or Shiva, and sulfur is the embodiment of the female principle of Shakti. And all the texts, which I will give you a small list just for curiosity, of chemistry, are presented as dialogues between Shiva and Shakti. So typically, Shakti will begin by, "Oh Shiva, please explain to me this, and then the explanation follows. So this is how it is. But interestingly, in Chinese alchemy, mercury is female and sulfur is male. So even chemical bodies can change their gender sometime. I don't know. But anyway, one double objective common to all these civilizations, in all alchemies, all the developments of alchemy, all the way to Europe in pre-modern chemistry, is one, transmuting base metal into gold. All of them will claim to do that. Even though actually some of the Indian texts make it clear that it is the appearance of gold, that they find ways to turn some metals, give them a golden appearance, and it seems that, though they are very obscure texts, very difficult to test, I will give you just one example. It seems that they are kind of aware that it is not actual gold, but it's hard to say. The second is longevity, elixir of life, so eventually immortality. So these are the objectives with which, but This is the mystical or philosophical aspect as you wish. There are also lots of practical aspects in preparing medicines, in work, playing with metals, combining metals with organic compounds, with medicinal herbs to produce all kinds of medicines. And this will become standard recipes in Ayurveda in particular, right up to today. So mercury is held to be divine in the alchemical practices, preparations and processes, and is supposed to give occult powers, including invisibility. These are some of the texts of chemistry. In fact, those manuscripts are listed by Prafulla Chandra Ray himself in his book, and they are usually fairly brief, typically 20, 30 pages text in Sanskrit. A few are available in translation. And they will speak of all kinds of preparations, but, and you see the word rasa being common to all of them, but the difficulty is to understand in modern terms, or let us say a current scientific term, what exactly is being done, because there is an esoteric side to it, deliberately esoteric. In fact, the student of Rasavidya, of chemistry, is sworn to secrecy. He has to have many virtues. They are listed, all kinds of ethical virtues of purity, application, concentration, this and that, and should not reveal the secrets that are taught. So therefore, the texts are not trying to be explicit. They are more trying to be, give landmarks for the students to memorize or to easily refer to. But it's quite obvious when you read some of these texts that they are just the tip of the iceberg. The rest is just not there in the text. So when you see, for example, mercury is, if you absorb mercury as it is, it's a poison, right? But mercury is still used today in some Ayurvedic Siddha preparations. I know it's controversial with some people, but there are Ayurvedic practitioners even today who confidently prescribe some mercury compounds. And in those texts, these 18 processes are described to treat, modify mercury, except that we are never given a full explanation for what is being done. So it's very difficult to really make sure that, and it's only the last and 18th step that will make the preparation consumable, fit for medical use. So this is still an area for, where a lot of research could be done. But of course, I understand that it's delicate for a professional chemist to venture into this. There are some risks are involved. And therefore, we've had, however, even after Prafulla Chandra Ray, there have been a few scholars who have tried to understand a little more in depth. And the last of them was B.V. Tsuburayapas, who passed away earlier this year, and who had visited us, in fact, at IIT Gandhinagar earlier, and who was a chemist by formation, and who wrote 2-3 massive books on Indian chemistry and chemical practices, trying to make better sense of what was going on. But, Prafulla Chandra Ray he was also trying to explain the apparatus, how people were actually working at processes of distillation, sublimation, condensation, and so on and so forth. You have all of them very well described in the text, but commented upon by him to, all kinds of furnaces. For example, this is a typical device for what is known as downward distillation, which is used in the extraction of zinc, and Indians were very good at zinc metallurgy. Zinc vaporizes easily. It has a low vaporizing temperature, and therefore you have to capture the vapor and condense it. So in that case, the ore will be kept at the top, and the charcoal will be kept exclusively at the top, so that the bottom will be a little cooler, and the vapor being forced down will condense on the walls of the pot. So these are some of the processes which are reasonably well understood, but the exact chemistry of all the reactions is not. So some more, and this is all from Prafulla Chandra Ray's book. So, of course, he sent his book to the first volume to Berthelot, who acknowledged it gratefully, and was always very warm in his, very encouraging in his communications with Prafulla Chandra Ray. And he immediately wrote a review in the same Journal des Savants, 1903, where he says, "We must thank Mr. Ray for the care with which he has gathered the materials for a difficult and obscure study, and for the precious details and commentaries that he included in his work. That history deals with medicine more than chemistry. In a word, chemistry is more subordinate to medicine. Methodical descriptions of the study and preparation of metals and other substances hardly appear before treatises written from the 14th and 15th centuries. So therefore, we find almost nothing like the systematic treatises of the Greco-Egyptians as we know them through the collection of the texts of the ancient Greek chemists, except for a few vague statements and mystical invocations here and there." So he maintained his opinion that basically Indian alchemy was kind of derived. It was not necessarily native to India, though he said, he explained in his review that there are two hypotheses. Either it is derived and much later, or else there must be earlier texts which somehow Prafulla Chandra Ray has not got to. And there are some, today, there are some earlier manuscripts which have appeared, but they do not go before the 8th or 9th century AD or CE. There are no very ancient texts comparable to the Greek texts in India, and there could be various explanations for it. I'm not going to go into this today because it's a very complex question. Finally, Berthelot he invited, not only he, but a French Indologist by the name of Sylvain Lévy, invited Prafulla Chandra Ray to Paris, and he traveled there in 1905, and he was received by Berthelot at the Collège de France, also at his home. And then, since Berthelot was the perpetual secretary, that's a French title, you can say permanent secretary if you like, of the Académie des Sciences in Paris, the most prestigious science body in France, he invited him to one session there. And also to visit his laboratory, which you can see here in this photograph, and which Prafulla Chandra Ray refers to in his autobiography. He wrote a very engaging autobiography in the 1930s, which is available again on acharya.org, and where he refers to this visit and how inspiring it was for him to see Berthelot still doing his research. So what happened is that Berthelot died in 1907. In fact, there's a small mystery about his death because he had declared that he was deeply attached to his wife, and he had declared to his children that he would not outlive his wife. And indeed, his wife passed away suddenly, and a few minutes later he was dead. So nobody knows really whether he committed suicide, as some suggested, or whether it was a natural death. But the fact is, 1907, he was no more, and the second volume of Prafulla Chandra Ray, in which he was hoping to address Berthelot's criticism about the lateness of Indian alchemy through a certain number of manuscripts, because the second volume consists mostly of manuscripts of Sanskrit and some commentaries. This appeared 2 years after Berthelot's death, so the dialogue, of course, was interrupted. But he wrote in his dedication to this second volume, "The great chemist and savant, whose inspiration has been my guiding principle throughout the arduous task, and whose lengthy and appreciative review of the first installment has been a stimulus in the continuation of it, is no more. All that now remains for me is to dedicate this volume to his sacred memory." So this is how the dialogue ended. But it was very fruitful, even though it may not have been conclusive. It still opened a new chapter, because before Prafulla Chandra Ray, there was almost no knowledge in the Indian public or the world public of Indian chemical practices or approaches or philosophy prior to modern science. So in this way, Prafulla Chandra Ray was not only a pioneer of chemistry in India, not only a pioneer of the teaching of chemistry and institution building and building of chemical industries, but also a pioneer of history of science, which is an aspect that we too often forget. So it is not often that a scientist combines all these aspects together. And in this, we should be much indebted to him. And it is a pity that the amount of research in history of Indian chemistry has been a little limited after him. I think there is still a lot of potential. So this is Prafulla Chandra Ray in his later years. He did not live long enough to see Indian independence, but by his time, he passed away, I think, in 1944. By that time, of course, independence was in sight, at least. So, great figure, very highly revered and respected. And I think that at many levels, scientific and human ethical level, we can learn a lot from him. So these are some acknowledgements of the sources that I've used. Thank you very much. And as I said, this was just intended to be a footnote, so I have amplified it a little bit. But we will hopefully have a full-fledged lecture on Prafulla Chandra Ray in another semester. Thank you.